All right, so here we are. We are rocking and rolling once again. Today we are picking up where we left off on talking about kind of the organizing philosophy, the fundamentals of research and so forth. So this is, if we didn't get a good enough chance to say it last Tuesday before we were so rudely interrupted by ice and snow. This is not just for folks doing, like lab research, field research, trials. This is also fully applicable to so-called like secondary documents research. So things like a literature review or like a research synthesis paper, that kind of thing. Those get turned into scholarly publications as well, because there is value, there is wisdom in bringing together a bunch of otherwise previously isolated things. So, if you're writing a big literature review, or a state of knowledge paper is another title for a literature review, when the literature review is the whole document, not just a chapter. Somebody gets to kind of take a step back from and regain sort of 360 awareness of everything that's going on in a particular field in terms of its recent developments, controversies, and the gaps in knowledge, all the parts we've talked about that go into the literature review section or document. And as a result, you get to synthesize and catch all of the things that each of those individual researchers or disparate scattered research groups working on a particular area, you get to spot and, highlight, call attention to, raise the alarm about, for example, or potentially of whatever those folks, squirreled away in their labs or off in their fields or forest plots, capturing their data. Like, they don't have any awareness of that stuff while they're working hard on their own specific narrow thing. So all of this, what we're talking about with, the positivist paradigm, it still also applies to research papers, state of knowledge, literature reviews, that sort of thing as well. Got a question about that from one of your classmates, saying, what is my research question? I'm not running an experiment, I'm doing a literature review. And it's kind of a synthesis paper instead of an experiment. And you still have a research question, right? Your data points are multiple other studies that you're synthesizing and bringing together. They're not individual number data points that go into a table in one of those papers. So you still have a research question. It is, what are you writing this paper about? What are you trying to answer? And it might be as simple and straightforward as, what is the current state of knowledge in area XYZ with, ag education, future farmers of America, or in my field, about every 5 years, there's a couple of professors that get together and write a state of knowledge review. And they just, since the previous paper was written, they kind of try to get their hands on all of the research that's been done in human recreation ecology and say, this is where we're at, this is where we're going. And this is where we're still seeing, nobody has really touched this other area here, but it's pressing. There are problems with this over here. Let's get some research attention on this area over here. So, don't feel like, if you're writing a literature review that is anything less than a thesis or dissertation, it's still a ton of work. You're still answering a research question, and it's just a different kind of science communication than running a single study and writing a few results on that. Okay, so I just want to encourage you with that. And again, all of this that we're talking about in the science, philosophy, and underpinning section applies to literature reviews and synthesis papers as well. So we left it off with a positivist paradigm, kind of the basic sense of, rational thinking and evidence-based methods and all of these buzzwords we hear about in Western culture. We're gonna pick it up again with one sort of absurd extreme example of the logical positivist reductionist paradigm in action. All right, so if we are, let's see, the right app in front here. So let's say you wanted to know something about religion, like you had a research question about how, how did religious beliefs play a role in terrorism at the end of the 20th century into the 21st, right? September 11th, 2001. Some people have suggested that religion may be involved in one way or another. And that could take a bunch of different angles. So the research question gets delineated down or delimited down, excuse me, into, what were religious responses to that traumatic event happening? How do people around the world sort of respond to this and organize their response or flavor or condition or shape their response based on their particular held religious beliefs? It's an interesting question. It's an important question because a large majority of people around the world ascribe some kind of value to some kind of religion. And so this is a big thing. It's scaled way up. It touches a lot of people. But the logical positivist reductionist paradigm would study religion by studying the people involved. That would be your unit of analysis. We're not maybe doing a word study on religious texts and seeing what that might talk about with mass tragedy. We want to know what people are thinking, what people are doing, how they're responding in this particular just hypothetical example. So in order to study people, in order to study religion, you got to study people because religion is a characteristic of people. And the study of people in large masses is sociology, right? And, in order to study people in large masses, in order to understand sort of how social movements, religions grow, evolve, respond to stimuli like terrorist attacks or whatever, in order to really break that down, to study it and know and understand the dynamics underpinning a research question, you got to get inside, a person's mind. So psychology is much more of a single person or patient focused area, but in studying enough individuals, we can build that up into a sense of a sociological larger people movement thing, and then we can back that out into our original research area, religion.
Hey,
And
Dr.
psychology,
Park.
fundamentally, you really break it down. When you reduce psychology into its most functional parts, it's brain chemistry. We use medicines, particular crafted molecules to affect mental, cognitive processes and human health in the sort of 55% fat cholesterol content that our gray matter is. Right? That's just microbiology, pharmacokinetics. How do these drugs work inside the brain? And really, biology, when you break it down, is just chemistry, right? We're talking about crafted molecules, designer molecules like vaccines, particular proteins are therapeutic in certain ways. So really, to understand religion, you got to be good at chemistry, right? And chemistry, when you boil it down, is just a bunch of atoms and subatomic particles and how they have very characteristic, predictable interactions and reactions and so forth. And physics, honestly, physics is nothing more under the hood than math. So if you want to study religion in a complex, multifaceted, ongoing, evolving set of, religion dynamics across lots of people across the entire surface of the earth, you got to get good at equations. Okay. Now, you can't really go past math. If we were joking about it, we'd say math is basically just philosophy, and philosophy is basically just religion.
I think Susan's watching.
Oh.
I think you could share your screen.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you. I was like, what?
There we go. All right. Can you see the positivist view of religion and a bunch of little chevrons?
I can, thank you.
Nice. Cool. Okay. So this is obviously this is an application of the reduction to absurdity logical fallacy, right? If you want to study how people of various religious faiths responded in the wake of September 11th or respond in the wake of a school shooting. I was a graduate student at Virginia Tech when that shooting of 30 plus people happened. You know, you don't turn to math, but the logical positivist approach is to how can we boil this down? How can we standardize our approach to this? How can we use research tools and assign numeric values to things and then figure out the equations that govern the behavior of those numeric values that we're seeing and so forth. So, you know, you wouldn't actually do this. This is not an ethical approach, but taken too far, it can start to look like this. When your tools are quantitative, when you're good at stats. As a PhD student, you take a bunch of stats classes. As a master's student, you take 1 or 2 stats classes. Maybe you like them, maybe it's just you get through. It's fine. But when those are your tools, you tend to start seeing the world in that way, right? When all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Exactly. So we want to keep this in mind. This is not to say that math is a bad tool. It's just, it's not always the right tool. Okay. So this is creating space for kind of the boomerang or pendulum effect, the opposite direction to what has been called the interpretivist paradigm, where you might never pull out a calculator in an interpretive study. So a researcher who studies how to study things explained the interpretive paradigm in this way. It is the study of social phenomena towards an empathic understanding. This is talking with people, sitting down for coffee with influential members of a community. In the Cache River Valley, for example, where Dr. Akamani has worked very hard to gain access to some otherwise generally what would seem like pretty closed communities. Like if you didn't grow up there and they don't know who your mama is and you didn't go to high school with them, you know, they don't trust you and they're not gonna let you know anything useful towards answering your research questions. So you gotta just spend time with people. One of my advisors, when I was a PhD student, spent several years in a couple of indigenous communities. So, you know, traditional, like we would think of them as like tribal level communities in Central America and the Caribbean. And most of his time in those communities was just spent being a presence there, letting people know that he was safe as a gringo, letting people know that he wasn't there to change anything or mess anything up or anything like that. Because his research question was, how do national parks screw over unintentionally indigenous peoples? So for example, in places like Costa Rica, which started designating areas as national parks really pretty recently, like within our lifetime. You know, they draw a square or a circle-ish shape on a blob on the map and say, this is now a protected biosphere reserve, and the United Nations is giving our government money to help set up this new national park system here in Costa Rica. It's going to be amazing. We're going to bring in tourism dollars. It's all going to be sustainable. We'll have people staying in like, you know, thatch huts in the treetops. It's cloud forest, like almost resorts, but it's going to be a park, so it'll be sustainable. It's going to be awesome. And as it turns out, all of the people that have been living there for thousands of years, you know, indigenous populations, they're like, well, we can't, it's now illegal for us to harvest wood so we can make a cook fire and sterilize our water so we don't die. And so people started showing up in prison for tree poaching in these national parks where it had been their equivalent of a backyard, you know, for some of these nomadic or pastoral communities. And in order to even start getting at that dynamic, to have people opening up and saying, this is our life now. This is how things got changed for us. We got voluntold into this or out of this land. It took a couple of years of being in those places and helping folks understand that if he wasn't there to narc on them, he wasn't going to turn them into authorities if they were sneaking into the national forest, like across the stream, right behind their hut, and getting some more wood for their cook fire. It was a really cool set of studies, and hopefully did some good. But it takes a very different paradigm. If you had parachuted in there with a bunch of surveys and cameras and all of that stuff, people would have just gone for the hills, and he would have been legitimately in danger. So not all things boil themselves down to a lab, and that's okay. Not everything that we need to know about can be represented in a row cropping, randomized complete block design, and so forth. Okay, so it's, instead of absolute truths, like boiling things down to mathematical equations that anybody can test, everything is expressed in relative terms. So we get into some pretty difficult territory for some of us raised in a more ag research tradition of needing to understand somebody else's, coming from a very different life background or a very different cultural background, what is their sense of morality? And getting comfortable with the idea of, if I don't recognize or necessarily agree with everything that somebody's articulating, that's okay. Because my system of belief as a researcher is potentially a blinder instead of a valuable contribution to that work. Okay, so we'll talk about some studies where this approach had to be kind of hammered out, figured out, really kind of starting in the 1950s and 60s as our Western industrialized society started to go real hard into modern statistical, quantitative, reductionist, positivist research out of the scientific revolution of the 1700s. Okay, so in some cases, researchers see the output of the research not in terms of publication, but in terms of like improving a community, meaningful social change, meaningful social action. This is called reactive research because you are changing the premise in some cases of what's going on if it seems like it's a pretty bad deal based on your research, based on the inputs of the people in that situation. All right. And so this can get weird. Like with my advisor researching folks displaced by national park designation, does he end up making decisions to help them get wood for their cook fires outside of the park, inside the park boundary, right? This is people's survival at stake. So in some cases, certain kinds of reactive research can come in conflict with law. As a researcher, your data can be subpoenaed. If you are, anyway, we'll talk about that later. This is non-trivial. So let's talk about ideographic versus nomothetic research. These are a couple of 10-cent words in epistemology. And ideographic research is, sorry, I had some lag there. Ideographic research, from the root of ideo, meaning unique, right? Same basis as the word idiot, used to mean something other than this person is of lower general intelligence than their peers. It used to mean this person is distinguished in some way, unique, not near the center of mass for any given population, whatever it is. So it's explanation of a single case. We often call this kind of research a case study. So if you want to understand the secret sauce behind what makes Apple a $1 trillion company with an internal economy larger than most countries in the world, right? Not everybody has $1 trillion of economic activity going on per year. You can't figure out equations for that because there's nobody really to compare apples to apples when you're looking at Apple, no pun intended. Okay, so idiographic research, case-based research is powerful. It's a deep dive into that. You meet a bunch of people, you spend a bunch of time there, you get saturated in that case. And then you start to piece together some sense of why is it the way it is? How did the influential people like Steve Jobs, Wozniak, Joni Ive, how did they kind of shape Apple? What's the internal work culture like? What are their processes for doing what they do, how they do, and so forth, all right? Idiographic research tends to be social in nature, tends to be qualitative. Lots of interviews, that sort of thing. Nomothetic research is what you and I probably thought of coming into this class as research, lab reports, stuff like that. Nomothetic research is the idea of things being generalizable. If I mix together solution A with solution B, swirl the test tube, I'm going to get the exact same result as somebody over in Kamchatka or in South Africa, mixing the same chemicals in the same way in the same kind of flask. It should be reducible to causal patterns. Okay, the truth is out there, Mulder, and this is called formally the covering law model. We should be able to work out dynamics that cover more specific cases. Okay, so quantum physics, quantum mechanics is along this line. Quantum mechanics pretty well describes all of chemistry. If you work out from the subatomic level, everything out from that. It takes a lot of computation to do it, but it actually works pretty well. There's some edge cases where it doesn't. We're working on that, but this is totally the show me your data. I don't believe in the power of your dreams whatsoever kind of approach. So some researchers who don't enjoy social interaction very much find a lot of comfort in the idea of everything being reducible to governing or covering, as they're called, laws. All right, and we get to better covering laws by proposing and demonstrating experiments in fully well-controlled, well-documented ways that anybody else can reproduce by disproving the current factual model. So we prove something else wrong. Charles Darwin agonizes for years and years and years over publishing The Origin of Species because that went against the current model of creationism that largely the Catholic Church, up to a point, had been putting forward as one of the sort of the governing social institutions of Western society. Right? He was, maybe thinking of folks like Galileo, also a researcher that broke the current Earth-centric model of, the sun goes around the Earth. We see it moving through our sky, so it must be moving around us, with careful observations and so forth, and said, well, actually, it might be a heliocentric system where the sun is stationary and we're moving around. Look at how the stars move in relation to us and the sun. It doesn't seem like the sun is moving around us. And Galileo got some grief by proposing that. Okay. So this nomothetic model gives us the scientific method. And this is the same scientific method model you saw back in 6th grade. But we'll break it down a little bit more. All right, so it's a process of what's your research question? Formulate that research question into a pair or multiple pairs of hypotheses. You've got the null hypothesis. A is not different than B. We didn't show that this mechanism works as we understand it. The alternative hypothesis, the pair to that null hypothesis, is we have proposed and demonstrated a model that works, okay? And you use statistical tests to not prove or disprove anything. Well, not prove anything. You can disprove things. If something works, you don't necessarily know why it worked. If you turn on your car and it turns on, you don't know why it turned on necessarily. If you remove the serpentine belt from your car and you try to turn it on and it doesn't turn on, you've disproven the idea that the engine works by itself. That serpentine belt is a necessary causal functioning component for that engine to turn over and keep running. Okay, so you disprove the null hypothesis. That lets you to tentatively, for now, until somebody else disproves it, breaking the covering law that you are suggesting. You tentatively accept your alternative hypothesis when you can. All right. You use methods in controlled experimental trials, analyze those data, you get your results in discussion, and that suggests a new research question, right? That's the outline format of your thesis or dissertation right there, but in a cyclic format now, because once you finish your thesis or dissertation, you're going to go on to the next research project, and maybe that next research project was suggested by your previous one. To try out your mechanism in some new context, in a different ecosystem, or at a different time, or with different people, or something like that. Okay, so you nuance, you add more on, and what you couldn't cover in your results and discussion because you weren't able to test it, that suggests your next research question. All right, so this is the deductive reasoning approach. All right, this is the Sherlock Holmes way to do. You take the general theory covering law, and you figure out a more specific, smaller theory that is contextualized to your specific area and time and people involved and so forth. And then you take that specific theory. That specific theory is like a half step before the hypothesis you're using for your particular study. And your study is the testable application of that hypothesis. Okay, so we form opinions on groups via media. This is the contact hypothesis. US television covers Muslims negatively in a post-2001 environment. Or anybody who might look Muslim, right? Folks of Arab descent or even just Mediterranean descent, and so forth. And then the testable application might be American teens at a particular high school that we have research access to in an ethical way. They view Muslims negatively based on the opinions sort of provided to them through mass media and these days social media. Okay. Deductive reasoning is the opposite approach. It is observing the idea that, wow, I'm hearing here and there, I'm seeing on Facebook, or these days it'd be, TikTok or WhatsApp or Instagram or whatever, seeing American teenagers' views of Muslims as they're expressed and spread on social media. So that suggests at least a specific theory, like a smaller localized theory around just American teens, that teens in contact with Muslims are less afraid. You get to know somebody and they're not scary. They like food just like you, and they have to take showers every once in a while just like you, and they put their pants on one leg at a time. Celebrities, they're just like us. And that leads to inductively from the ground up seeing observations and then building a small theory and then a bigger, more covering theory, something like the contact hypothesis, where we get the sense of more contact means less fear and so forth. Okay, so just kind of making sense. You can go from big high altitude covering law down to a very specific thing in off field, or CFFA, folks or FFA students coming to SIU specifically, down from some huge sense of if we do not tell them about agriculture, they will not come, kind of a thing. Or you could start with, hey, I was just walking through the breezeway at SIU the other day, or at the Ag building the other day, and I saw a bunch of kiddos. They looked like they were in varsity jackets, but they weren't varsity jackets, well, sports jackets. They had a bunch of other FFA stuff, patches sewn on there. What's bringing them here? How's that going? It's from the ground up, just something you observe and start to form a limited theory and then a more broad theory out of that. These are the same thing. Sorry for my Microsoft Word art mangling deduction there, but it's just two different sides of that same circle that we just saw of the scientific method. Okay, so for your study, you want to think and be real clear on what is my, and this also applies for lit reviews and stuff like that, state of knowledge papers. What is my study? Am I deducing? Am I standing on the shoulders of previous publications and testing some smaller part of that in my research setup? Or am I starting without a theory? I'm just observing something. I'm noticing something about the world and thinking, oh, that's interesting and weird. I wonder what more general causative or explanatory thought, hypothesis we could come up with at the end of the study instead of starting with a hypothesis to test and try to break. All right, so take a moment to think. Most of us in graduate school are going to be doing deductive research, theory testing. For somebody doing a more qualitative study, it's entirely okay and more appropriate if you're doing theory building for something that doesn't have a well-articulated, recognizable, or tested governing theory. You got to start somewhere, right? And if there's just nothing governing what you are looking at, then it's inductive research, and that's perfectly valid. So this also gives us kind of a sequence or a progression of kind of what stage of maturity, so to speak, although that's kind of a loaded word, for your research project are you at. Exploratory research is, we don't even really know what the phenomenon is yet. We're just kind of poking around. Maybe we've developed a new kind of sensor. We're observing some new theorized subatomic particle, but nobody's ever seen it yet. We're not totally sure what it's going to be like until we just start looking. So we're just going to start looking. That's exploratory research. Pilot studies are often exploratory research. So it's a small, quick, lightweight study done to amass some basic fundamental understanding so you can go chase funding for a bigger, more exhaustive, thorough, mechanistic study. All right. Descriptive research, you're answering questions of what's the specific characteristics of this phenomenon that I'm interested in that has been discovered with exploratory research. How big is it? How long-lived is it? How many of them are there? Where do we find the extent of habitat for this new species that we've just discovered in Shawnee National Forest? So it's basics like when, where, who, biological characteristics, what's its typical biomass in this population that we're studying? What's its metabolic characteristics, that sort of thing. Once we have a bunch of descriptive research compiled about whatever our phenomenon is, the thing that we're studying, explanatory research, that's where we start testing things and trying to break our ideas by disproving them in deductive research. So explanatory research is very common for PhD students. It's pretty common for master's students. Descriptive research, kind of one step before that, is pretty common for master's students and very common for master's students who are doing field work, field research. Right? If we want to figure out how or why a new newly developed pesticide works better than something else, we need to do first a bunch of fully controlled lab and test tube research to figure out how that works in a completely controlled environment. Then we can start to generalize it out to a bunch more descriptive research out in a bunch of fields and see how it actually works under live conditions instead of super controlled, kind of fake or synthetic lab conditions. So explanatory research sounds awesome. Sounds like this is the prestige. We are understanding the mechanism and the model, and we're, statistically controlling for X, Y, and Z and all of that. And it's super fancy and nice looking. But not all research can be explanatory. Most field research cannot be fully controlled. You just can't control the weather, for example. When I was a student at the Biosphere 2 Institute in the deserts of Arizona, it was a fully controlled sort of simulated Mars colony, right? Airlocks and everything, fully contained, self-contained ecosystems from all over the world. And they've since used it since that pair of experiments ran with hilarity and cults involved. True story, we'll talk about it another time. They've used that facility to do some of the very first full-scale, fully controlled field research for climate change, because that facility is large enough to have fully grown, mature trees inside an airtight, watertight, nutrient-tight greenhouse environment where they can completely control the balance of carbon dioxide and so forth. Going out to Shawnee National Forest, we can only observe and categorize when, where, who, and so forth in terms of trees being subjected to changing levels of carbon dioxide as we change our climate. So that's descriptive, all right? Sometimes you'll get purists poo-pooing anything but explanatory research, but you need to remind them that the real world is not a hermetically sealed lab environment, and lab environments are nice when we can use them. They're also insanely expensive and kind of slow. So there's that, right? We need all of these different parts. Otherwise, the apparatus of research in general doesn't happen. So don't let anybody talk down to you about the kind of research that you're doing. If your advisor has you on a pilot study, it's probably smaller, a little bit more nimble, a little bit more within reach of a few people instead of like a huge, massively funded, ponderous, slow research group. And you're probably way out on the cutting edge. Like if you're doing exploratory research, you are well out past the comfortable, easy stuff. All right, that's cool. That's exciting for some people. Other folks would like to have a little bit more control in their lives and tend to gravitate more towards explanatory or lab-based research. So whatever your particular temperament, whatever your wiring is fine. But it's good to kind of reflect on and ask yourself, am I more of an exploratory researcher? Like I want to Indiana Jones my way through life, or I want to have the perfectly produced, fully scribed lab report from a laboratory environment, right? I go each day and I work for my 8 hours and I go home and turn off the lights in the lab at the end of the day, right? Totally different vibes. All of it is research. Okay, so this is what I got so far. Research paradigms, some of the basic structures of research. Where we're heading next is to get a couple more examples of exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory research, and then we'll start catapulting forward into things like ethics and so forth. All right, so exploratory, emergent phenomena. Something new is happening, and we don't have the prior research tools even necessarily to figure it out. Okay, so again, if you are on the edge of something, you're probably doing exploratory research. This is less commonly published because publications tend to favor things like field research or explanatory research because you have well-known procedures. People are familiar with the scope and type of the data and that sort of thing. Like it's recognizable. With exploratory research, we don't know, and we're up to a point kind of flailing around the phenomenon, whatever it is, to try and get any initial picture of what it is. So here are terms like pilot and preliminary. For descriptive research, kind of one step up past that, we've identified some new phenomenon, some new social dynamics, some new question that combines factors in a new way that nobody's ever done. Now we need to start getting sort of a sense of what's the scale, the scope, the shape of it. Anything that's describing the attributes of a phenomenon, solidly descriptive work. And this lends itself really well to understanding your research question really well early on. So if you're doing a bunch of field research, your research question probably is going to specify a location, a time scale, like is this instantaneous moment to moment, like millisecond scale? Is this the growing season? Is this across the course of a year? Is this a decadal trend? So time slices of multiple years repeated for 10 years. Is it a longer term ecological research study? LTERs are amazing things provided by the federal government to do some very, very hard research. Pardon? LTER, they are research stations. So it'd be like the university farms, where the government says, we're gonna write a contract with SIU to fund this research study on, developing the perfect optimized soybean cultivar for Southern Illinois. We're gonna fund that for 75 years because, we can mutate strains and stuff like that pretty quickly and have 6 generations of soybeans in a place like Puerto Rico, for example, 6 growing seasons in a row. But some of the finer points of it, like the effects on human health of this particular new optimized soybean, that can take years. And we really need to know the answer to this question, and there's just no other way to do it. We'll do some shorter term things, but LTERs, those long-term ecological research sites, are some of them are just funded indefinitely, and some of them are over 100 years old. So they're incredibly valuable because there are so few of them. It's just one way of doing that kind of research when it needs that kind of a time scale to be done.
Is that within our Belleville? Is that something?
I'm not sure if that's an LTER specifically. Okay. That's like a specific government designation, but there's a bunch of long-term research sites that might not be LTERs. But yeah, the principle is the same either way. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so for you, most of us probably in descriptive or explanatory phase. And again, this question still completely applies to anybody doing a literature review or document type search or synthesis or summary. Would you say that you are trying to answer descriptive questions? So real question of the class, or explanatory questions, or possibly exploratory, but that's more rare. So what do you think? Where you at? I do a little bit of both in my work. Just depends on the specific project.
Yeah, I feel like I'm doing a pretty traditional field study that not be explanatory.
It can be. It's not automatically. So you'll have as much control over as many variables as you can, but in your analysis phase, you're going to have to account for some things that you just don't have perfect control over, like how many millimeters of precipitation do we get this year? It's a little bit more than previous years, so we're going to interpret our data in light of the idea that we got 5% more rain this year, and all of that extra 5% was in a single highly destructive storm, and that that might shape your data somehow, and that's fine. Like, it's not anybody's fault. It just happens, and you clarify why the data are exactly the way they are. In a lab experiment where you're doing row cropping stuff in a field under grow lights and spraying precip or drip hosing precip into the soil, that is completely controlled. It's also not reflective of real life because grow lights are not full spectrum sunlight, for example, and so there's pretty different microbial activity that can happen in a lab experiment, even if you're trying to faithfully replicate outdoors but have full control over it. So field research can totally be explanatory. Just keep in mind that it's not a perfectly controlled system. Good answer. Anybody else?
I think I'm probably descriptive.
Okay.
Describing the distribution of the species.
Yeah, totally. most of the research that I do that has a geospatial component tends to be more descriptive. Yeah. So anything involving map analysis and stuff like that, you're analyzing what's there and so forth and presenting it in new ways, but I'm not necessarily applying experimental treatments to one track versus another necessarily. I'm just describing the spatial extent of what's the denning habitat versus the mating habitat versus the rearing habitat of some species that's never been mapped before. We don't want to run experiments on that because we don't know enough yet to safely do that. We need to fully describe it first. So yeah, cannot get away from descriptive research. Anybody else?
We go to stores,
Okay.
gathering and see what their people's perspective.
Yeah. So your project, we've had a lot of conversations that they're more free flowing. It has the word could in that conversation a lot more, or might, than somebody designing a bench chemistry experiment. Bench chemistry experiment has a lot more of because in it. Okay. All right, so let's jump through. What about, let's see, jump through here. So let's say we have a question about, and we'll end on this, campus awareness of sustainability issues, right? We have a sustainability office, we have a green fund. This is an issue that students have in the past indicated to university administrators is really important. And so, this is people's job now, right here on this campus. So let's say we want to know more, we want to understand students' awareness of sustainability issues on campus. Is this fundamentally a descriptive effort or an explanatory effort or exploratory? What do you think?
Would it be descriptive because you're just sort of describing like the general feeling, or is it too vague in that?
It's we've got some sense of the basic idea of it. So you're right, it's more descriptive than exploratory. If we are figuring out what word to use in the first place, is this about sustainability? Is it about ecological responsibility? Is it environmental justice? That's more exploratory. Like we're not real sure which direction we're going yet with it. When we got a pretty well-defined, at least initial sense, it's much more likely descriptive. Yeah. Okay. So what kind of,
If we're trying to figure out like what the students are aware of on campus, we need to do like a statistical kind of survey or something. See what people even know about or aware about.
yeah. So we can collect some descriptive statistics about the students in general, and then about their understanding, their awareness, their opinions, their preferences on campus awareness of this particular issue. And we can start potentially getting into tests of like statistical modeling, trying to figure out causality. So asking more questions along why are students in such and such department 40% more likely on average across students in that department to self-report that they're passionate about campus sustainability issues, passionate about the idea that we have a coal-fired power plant and a president that has refused to put up solar panels on campus and stuff like that. We can start to run some statistical tests on that, but we can't necessarily establish causality, saying A causes B or A influences B with purely descriptive data. So we'll start next class with talking about how do we set up an experiment to examine correlation. One tends to be associated with another versus causality, where one influences, drives, causes, destroys, modifies another. Okay, so input versus output variables. Independent versus dependent variables. Cool. I'm not going to get into a bunch of equations on that, but we do want to kind of understand the mindset of what we can test and figure out with stats and so forth. All right. I'm around for questions. I hope things are going well. No class on Thursday. I have a professional obligation. It's going to pull me away from campus. So that'll be all right. I'll post this recording online and we'll meet again next week. Sounds good. Cool. Keep an eye on the course website. I will see you next time, and I'm around for questions now if you need them.
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
Okay. Again, I don't know what I'm doing, so.